I'm Curt Dupriez, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the price-busting Mercedes-Benz GLC200, which joined the German brand's mid-size SUV lineup back in March. How price-busting? Well, the GLC200 launched at $89,000 list or $95,500 drive away. That is a whopping 16 grand more affordable than the GLC300, which was the only Mercedes-Benz branded version of this GLC that you could get in the last 2 years since it launched in 2023. At least that is without dipping into the AMG catalogue. Cheap? Well, not really, and that's because the last GLC 200 that was offered back when the old first generation got put to pasture back in 2023 was $80,800, or about 10% cheaper. So what's changed in this Gen 2 version, and is it good value? And is it upmarket and Mercedes-Benz enough to warrant that sort of premium over mainstream rivals that are getting nicer and fancier by the day? Let's find out. Chasing Cars. Honest reviews of your next car.
Brought to you by
Budget Direct. Of course, the big change here is that the new 200 is built off the second generation GLC. And the elevator synopsis is that it's longer, wider and lower than the first generation, if not actually any larger, and that extends to interior space. When this Gen 2 did launch a couple of years ago, the exterior styling was a subtle evolution and the big change was on the interior, but more about that soon. And you can check out our review of the GLC 300 for more of a deep dive on those Gen 2 changes elsewhere on our channel. But the big change for Gen 2 is that it now says 4MATIC on the tailgate. The old version was rear-wheel drive, this one is all-wheel drive, and that does go some way to justifying some of that 10 grand premium. That all-wheel drive now does bring some dedicated off-road trickery, although that's probably better suited to that milder, nicely graded European stuff than the more hardcore stuff that you will find in Australia. And that's particularly given how pretty these 19-inch wheels are. Which brings us neatly to the sporty AMG line stuff, or more specifically, lack thereof. That's right, like so many humble variants from so many German car makers, the GLC 200 does not fit any go faster, sporty looking accoutrement on the outside. However, if you do want the poser aesthetic, the less comfortable interior and the firmer riding 20-inch wheels, you can get a sports pack that costs an extra 6 grand. But our more befitting avant-garde spec is a little bit more classic Mercedes-Benz. So up front you get a more traditional grille and front fascia with lots of lashings of chrome, a more traditional Mercedes-Benz badge and adaptive high beam LED headlights. In terms of rolling stock, it gets these 19-inch, not very off-road suitable Tremolite grey alloy wheels that are fitted with 235/15 rubber front and rear, unlike the staggered wheels that you do get on the GLC 300. This inky obsidian black is slightly metallic and an $850 option, although you can get solid black as standard, and it's complemented by frosted silver detailing as well as rear privacy glass. And the full-length panoramic glass roof with cloth headliner is standard issue. I'm not too sure though about these aluminium look side running boards, which are too narrow to stand on, but wide enough to jab you in the back of your calf as you're climbing in or out. However, these can be delete optioned at no cost when you do order the car. In Benz's words, removing the side skirts will underline the off-road capability. But given the modest ride height, I'd be really concerned about taking this too far off-road into the mulga. Speaking of out back of the GLC, it does let its hair down a little bit with dual exhaust outlets. However, they're both fake. And besides the little bobtail, thankfully, there are no big wings or racing stripes. It's the kind of aesthetics that's ideal for those of us who don't want to look like we're doing a hot lap of Mount Panorama when we're just taking the dog down to the park for walkies. So let's see if that subtle classiness does extend to the interior. Climb in and the first thing that strikes you is that there's not much of a difference or much of a downgrade compared to the GLC 300. And it is quite familiar in here given that it's been around for a couple of years in the GLC 300 and that robbed from the C-Class. Like the exterior, the interior gets regular avant-garde fit out rather than the AMG line stuff, and for my money, all the better for it. This macchiato beige and black combination, which is one of 4 that's available, really does anchor the luxury vibe. And much of it is trimmed in what Mercedes-Benz calls Art Deco, or faux leather. The so-called comfort seats are a lot more leisurely bolstered than the rib-hugging AMG line stuff, although they still have a lot of purpose and lateral support. But the big advantage for me that they have is that you can shift around your posture when you're out on those long road trips. You do get 4-way electric lumbar on both front seats as well as memory functionality. Speaking of which, rather than one of those really chunky rimmed AMG line wheels, you do get this more elegant tiller, which does have handy pedal shifters. The switchgear though is a bit of a mixed bag, particularly when it comes to the volume slider. I, like so many others, actually prefer physical buttons to sliders, which seem to be stolen from old Apple laptop computers. And it's not a surprise that both Apple and the automotive industry are moving away from this slider rubbish. But it is part of this Mercedes-Benz design language, which basically removes all dials and buttons from the center stack. And while I can see what the designers were going for, I don't think it's really well executed here in the GLC format. In concept, you have a hard glassy control surface that floats across a soft substrate that's separated by colourful mood lighting. It is an idea that works particularly well on the door panels and the overhead control module, but it doesn't work here on the dash. And that's because the concept here of this floating screen sits above this really strange shiny plastic surface that looks like it was made for kitchen appliances. Not helping the GLC's cause is that it really is full of this sort of strange plastic chrome. And this piano black here is really going to beam the sunlight straight in your face when it comes through the panoramic roof. The digital displays though are really first class, and the MBUX system is quite rich when it comes to content, look and feel. However, I don't quite know while it's angled towards the roof. For some time now, Benz really has dived deep down the techno rabbit hole, much more than some of its competitors. But the net effect is that some of this does come across as being a bit chintzy. That said, the driver's screen is hugely configurable, and I do like the fact that they've kept the HVAC controls in the bottom of the media touchscreen. Some of the content is very slick, and the wireless phone charging is very fast, and the mapping is quite excellent too. And in this all-wheel drive version of the GLC with off-road mode, you do get the fairly nifty transparent bonnet feature. The door bins are absolutely massive, big enough for a couple of bottles of wine. But this center console cubby here is a little bit pokey, and you really have to jam your phone up there for the inductive charge pad. Right, let's check out row 2. For a mid-size SUV, the GLC is only moderately spacious, but it is reasonably comfortable in the back here. Visibility here is actually really quite good, particularly through to the front row. But if you want that real sense of airiness, you have to open the panoramic roof. In terms of amenities, it's all fairly expected stuff, including 2 air vents, 2 USB-C ports, and this funny little cubby which doesn't seem to be large enough to fit a phone. But what it does do is it looks a bit like a mouth with 2 googly eyes on top. This really is probably a better proposition for 2 adults in the back rather than 3, and there is quite a proud transmission tunnel, so you can put 3 loved ones in here, but only if they like to play footsies with one another. Right, let's check out the boot. Boot space is quoted at 620 litres, which must be to the ceiling, and that's 50 litres up on the first gen GLC. If you do drop the 40-20-40 rear split seat backs, it will liberate 1,640 litres. And under the floor, you do get a space saver spare. Let's check out under the bonnet. If powertrain torque makes you glaze over, you can skip forward a couple of minutes to our on-road experience, but there is an elephant in the room, and it's crammed under the GLC200's bonnet. Benz calls this engine electrified, but it stops short of calling it a hybrid or a mild hybrid, whatever that happens to mean. So you get a 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder engine, good for 150 kilowatts and 320 newton meters. So far, so normal. And it also fits an integrated starter generator, or ISG, which is powered by a 48-volt electrical system. In Benz's words, the ISG supplies gliding, boost and recuperation. Boost, you say? In Benz's words, the ISG adds 17 kilowatts and 205 newton meters to the engine's output. And kindergarten maths suggests that this now creates 167 kilowatts and 525 newton meters. And that's despite the fact that in the media screen there is a power and torque meter that only displays up to 150 kilowatts and 320 newton meters. Paired with a 9-speed automatic and in Gen 2 all-wheel drive, that should make for a pretty exciting experience when you hit the road. And that's precisely where we're heading right now. But then you hit the road and you discover that no, there's no real sort of V8 style torque thump when internal combustion and electricity sing together in a duet. That's not to say that it's not quick when it wants to be. When you do put it in sport mode, there is quite a bit of shove. But all of it seems to be coming from the turbo petrol engine, and if there is electric assistance, it's pretty mild at that. And this is backed up in real-world acceleration. Now, Mercedes-Benz claims that the GLC200 will hit 100 kilometers an hour from a standstill in 7.8 seconds. And that's about what you would expect just from a 2-litre petrol engine outputting 150 kilowatts and 320 newton meters. So that 48-volt ISG that supposedly adds 17 kilowatts and 205 newton meters to internal combustion doesn't really add that much by the seat of the pants, or by the stopwatch. Nor does the GLC200 drive under electric power alone. And given that Mercedes-Benz isn't claiming this is a hybrid of any sort, it's not surprising that it doesn't drive on electricity alone. Which brings us to fuel consumption, which is 7.5 litres per 100 NEDC, which is the less accurate figure than the WLTP figure that we do tend to use in Australia. And if there was any electrical assistance to the efficiency, that 7.5 figure would be pretty lousy. Not that I'm necessarily having a hard go at the powertrain. In fact, it's pretty smooth and pretty quiet, apart from the occasional abrupt upshift with a 9-speed automatic. It's just that really there's not that much special to report when it comes to performance or economy from this particular powertrain, regardless of what that 48-volt assistance might suggest. The GLC sits on the same MRA2 platform as the regular C-Class, and that's some pretty decent pedigree when it comes to ride and handling dynamics. Suspension-wise, it fits agility control with selective damping, which is a pretty fancy way to say that they're passive dampers with 2 valves. What it tends to do is it gives you decent ride comfort in a straight line, but it does firm up the damping a little bit when the body tends to roll. It is non-adjustable and clearly tuned for comfort, and if anything, it's a little bit too softly set in the rear end. Load up with 4 other loved ones and luggage, and the rear end can tend to just bounce around a little bit too much. Add those chunky 55 series tyres, and the GLC200 does do a pretty good job of ironing out most of the road acne. It carries some speed, and the Benz does get very settled out on the open road, and it's pretty stable too, but when you do drop down to urban speeds, the ride can get a little bit fizzy. In short, there's nothing really worth moaning about, but it's not the last word in refinement. One other characteristic which we did find with the GLC300 and a whole slew of Mercedes-Benz SUVs for the last couple of generations is that it does get this unusual sort of body wobble. I'm not really sure what that is, but it just seems not terribly tied down when it comes to body control. And you do get to get tossed around a little bit as the wheels ride up and down the lumps on the road. In a nutshell, it's not really that surprising. The GLC200 drives a lot like the GLC300 with less pep under the right foot and less enthusiasm through the corners. Not that much of this is really going to put off prospective GLC200 buyers, especially given this is the base version in the mid-size SUV lineup. Safety-wise, the GLC200 fits all-speed forward AEB, reversing AEB and junction assist, and a whole gamut of lane assistance technologies. There's also driver monitoring that you can turn off, and it will stay off regardless of how many times you turn the vehicle on and off. And what I found in my week with the GLC is that there are very, very few active annoyances. But probably the big advantage that this generation, the GLC200, has over the old is of course the all-wheel drive system. And it makes it much more sure-footed on days where you get lousy weather like we do today. Of course, primarily the all-wheel drive system gives you a big advantage when it comes to traction. And because you get better traction, you inherently get better grip because it makes the tyres work better. And that all-wheel drive system does go some way in justifying that 10 grand premium over the old generation. But it's not without some gremlins. Now, twice this week with a car, I've had the reverse AEB jam the brakes on me, and one of those was reversing into my own car space at home, which I've managed to negotiate well enough without hitting anything for 12 years now. And I suspect that the issue is down to the parking sensors, which are prone to a lot of false positives. And then there's the voice activation system. Now, it tends to want to speak at you randomly for no apparent reason, and particularly multiple times when you're talking to someone on speakerphone. But how about the rest of the ownership experience? Well, when it comes to fuel economy, we've seen combined the GLC200 will return mid to high sevens. They spend too much time around town or in peak hour, and that will climb up to double figures. As mentioned earlier, it's barely more frugal than the 190 kilowatt combination in the GLC300, and it demands premium fuel. Servicing is a bit mixed. On the plus side, intervals are 12 months and a long 25,000 kilometres, but on the downside, a 5-year package will cost you a frosty $7,350. The GLC200 adds a measurably more attainable variant to the Mercedes-Benz midsize SUV lineup. But the austere exterior and overblown interior is a combination that's really going to appeal to some buyer tastes. And we're not all that convinced that the refinement and execution is really up to Mercedes-Benz standard, even if the price tag most definitely is. But as mentioned earlier, the addition of all-wheel drive does go some way into offsetting that extra 10 grand premium over Gen 1. But the risk this car really has is that the mainstream continues to push up market, in some ways with features and in other ways with execution. And a perfect case in point is the just launched third generation Volkswagen Tiguan 150 TSI Elegance. It lacks none of the features and flash of the Benz, and its 150 kilowatt all-pole powertrain is really parity to this Mercedes. But the Volkswagen adds 15-stage adaptive damping, variable steering, and real leather trim. But at a touch over $60,000, the Tiguan is only 2/3 of the price of the Mercedes-Benz. We suspect that some of the rivals lack nothing to the Mercedes-Benz except outside of badge cachet, but for some owners, that TriStar is going to be worth every penny. So that's what I think, but how about you? Put your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe while you're at it. And as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.